Welcome to the University of the Free State.
Wa amohelwa ho University of the Free State.
Welkom by die Universiteit van die Vrystaat.
Siyakwamukela eNyuvesi yase-Free State.
Situated in the heart of South Africa, my university is a creation of the past, the present, and the future. Across our 3 campuses, 7 faculties have been home to some of the most magnificent minds. Everything we do is rooted in our values of excellence, innovation and impact, accountability, care, social justice, and sustainability. We have been changing the world for more than a century. We continue to pave the way and inspire a fresh stream of knowledge and skill to follow in the footsteps of our scholars and alumni. We hunger for knowledge that will help us to be better and to do better. Our facilities encourage excellence, pulling us towards the light of new insight and ways of applying what we know. We lead by example, advocating sustainability in everything that we do. While we are making a current impact, we are also steering towards the future with the knowledge and skills we need to take the lead. The next years will be especially significant in our growth as our Vision 130 unfolds, which will peak in 2034 when the University of the Free State celebrates 130 years of existence. Vision 130 is our strategic intent to reposition the university for 2034. Join us on this journey. Together, we will go further.
Good afternoon to you all. Thank you. It's nice to have you here. We'll be starting shortly, so we can relax and wait for our guests. Thank you. Okay, once again, good afternoon, and thank you so much for your attention, the University of the Free State community, those who are here in person, and those joining us via live stream, thank you for attending. My name is Professor Sevius Guburiro, a behavioral development economist here at the UFS, and I will be the program director for this afternoon's academic event. We are pleased to have you all for this prestige lecture. In fact, this is our inaugural Vice Chancellor Prestige Lecture, and we are so privileged to have a world-renowned economist, Prof. Jeffrey David Sachs, and in person to deliver this prestige lecture. So his title of presentation is Strategies for Rapid Long-Term Growth in Africa. So what are those strategies that our youthful economy called Africa need in order for us to realize long-term growth? And it must be rapid. I'm sure you are all waiting to hear what we are going to hear today. It is an honor, Prof. Sachs, to have you here. Colleagues, I will actually introduce Prof. Sachs formally in a few minutes, but at this juncture, let me recognize our rectorate and executive management led by our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Prof. Hester Klopper, who is going to come to the podium in a minute, Prof. Vasu Reddy, Dr. Temba Shasho, and thank you so much for honoring us with your presence. The deanery and HODs who are here present, thank you. Of course, our precious students and staff from different faculties across the UFS, please feel welcomed. So without further ado, let me call our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Prof. Klopper, to come to the podium and present a welcome address. Prof. Klopper, you're welcome.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, students, friends of the university, and this afternoon, our guest of honor, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the world-renowned Jeffrey Sachs. We are so honored to have you here, and it's a privilege to welcome each and every one of you here this afternoon to this Vice Chancellor's Prestige Lecture. And this is indeed an opportunity here at the university where we see it as transformative ideas that meet engaged minds. So on that note, please forget about what's outside of these doors and let's engage in terms of what Professor Sachs will be sharing with us here this afternoon. It's lectures like this that we see that really represents the university's commitment to thought leadership and ultimately to our determination to position the University of the Free State as a space where critical conversations about the world's most pressing challenges can unfold. Throughout the history of our university, there has been many lectures. Some was part of the previous vice-chancellor's lectures, memorial lectures, etc., and also lectures across faculties. And each of those have uniquely contributed towards the university and the discourse of the day. We see these lectures as mainly with two focuses, two important aims, and that is to enrich our intellectual landscape, but also to connect us into the broader conversations of the day. So today, we welcome a speaker that have been consistently and effectively accomplishing both these goals across platforms, across countries, across the globe. Just as we were welcoming Prof. Sachs here, he was sharing with us he left New York the last week of September, and he can later share, but the number of countries he's been around the globe, and then we'll be back in New York for 2 weeks, and then off he goes again. And that exactly explains the work that he's been doing and people wanting to listen to him. His topic today, Strategies for Rapid Long-Term Growth in Africa, speaks directly to the heart of our continental aspirations and challenges. As we know, Africa stands at a pivotal point and moment in the history. This is a continent that has extraordinary potential, confronted with persistent inequalities and young and dynamic population that's seeking pathways to prosperity, ways to build nations, and striving towards sustainable development. And yet, we need to find answers to all the questions. So Prof. Sachs brings decades of expertise with him in sustainable development, poverty alleviation, economic transformation, and this afternoon he will lead that conversation. His insights will undoubtedly illuminate the possibilities that we must embrace looking into the future of Africa. I read a bit about Prof. Sachs, and one thing that I saw was that consistently in his speeches, he's emphasized that no strategy for growth can succeed without a very solid foundation, and he sees that foundation as education. So he consistently advocates for education as the most critical investment any society can make, and that really resonates with our institutional values. Also, very proud for me to share that Prof. Sachs is one of our alumni, because in 2015, he was handed the honorary degree here at the University of the Free State. But it goes a bit further. And this is that he actually has roots here in the Free State. And that is that his grandfather lived in Vicksburg and then attended Grey College. And if I could recall correctly, his grandfather's sister also ended up here, and her children also attended Grey College. So Prof. Sachs, we trust that being here in this province, renowned for its hospitality, its warmth, it's not only about you attending and visiting the university, but it's indeed somewhat of a homecoming to your roots. If we look at what the university wants to accomplish with hosting this prestigious lecture, it is really around the question of what is the role of education in our vision, and the vision being building a responsible societal future. And therefore, education is not merely a pathway to economic opportunities, but it's the very fabric that weaves the future of our society. It shapes the way that citizens think critically, leaders act ethically, and communities that embrace the diversity. Prof. Sachs has been very clear in his assessment that the global education system faces a crisis of chronic underinvestment, and we see that on our continent and also within our country. And the impact has been particularly in low-income countries, where children are neither learning adequately or completing their education. And this remains a challenge for our continent. So this understanding really aligns seamlessly with how the University of the Free State's strategic commitments to creating responsible societal futures is embedded. We recognize that our role extends beyond graduates with only certain skills, but it is about building responsible citizens. So Prof. Sachs' presence here this afternoon reminds us that academia can never be detached from the urgent realities that we see in our society. We honor your scholarship, we honor your presence, we honor your advocacy, and your dedication to creating a more than just world for all of us. And we're indeed looking forward to the wisdom that you will be sharing with us here this afternoon, Prof. Sachs. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Prof. Klopper, for your opening speech. We all feel honored. Just so that we are all clear on how we will proceed, I'm going to formally introduce our guest speaker, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, by reading out his abridged biography. I had to ask for a very shortened one so that we have more time to the actual lecture. And because his lecture is immediately followed by a formal response from Prof. Philip Berger, I will read Prof. Berger's short bio too, so that after Prof. Sachs' presentation, Prof. Berger will immediately take the stage. Okay. So who is the speaker, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs? Prof. Jeffrey Sachs serves as university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University in the US, where he previously led the Earth Institute from 2002 to 2016. Recognized as one of the most influential economists in the modern world, Prof. Sachs is president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, co-chair of the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, and commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development. He has served as special advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General, our Kofi Annan, our Ban Ki-moon, and the current Antonio Guterres. And currently acts as an SDG advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Before joining Columbia, he spent more than 2 decades at Harvard University, where he earned his BA, MA, and PhD degrees, and all in economics. A recipient of 42 honorary doctorates, of course, including one conferred by the UFS in 2015, so we are part of the 42. Prof. Sachs' numerous accolades include the 2022 Tang Prize in Sustainable Development, the Legion of Honor from the President of France, and the Order of the Cross from the President of Estonia. His most recent publications include The Edges of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions, which was published in 2020, and The Ethics in Action for Sustainable Development, published in 2022. Thank you, Prof. Sachs, for honoring our invite. Great. Now I am turning to the respondent's short bio. Prof. Philip Berger has been Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at UFS since 2022, and Professor of Economics since 2007. He was a 2016-2017 Fulbright Exchange Scholar at Columbia University's Earth Institute, hosted by Prof. Sachs, I would want to believe, where he authored a book, Getting It Right, A New Economy for South Africa. And this book was launched at the IMF, at the World Bank, and the Rand Corporation, and later published in 2018. Since April 2022, he serves as a non-resident senior research fellow at the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research, leading the macro-fiscal workstream for Southern Africa towards inclusive economic development. We normally refer to it as the SA Tide Phase 2. He was part of the Fiscal Policy and Financial Markets Task Team of the Lancet Commission on COVID-19. His international experience includes a 2009 stint at the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, researching public-private partnerships and the global financial crisis, and secondments to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 2007, 2010, and 2012, again focusing on PPPs and capital budgeting. Prof. Berger is a past president of the Economic Society of South Africa and a former member of the South African Statistics Council. He has authored school books and numerous articles on macroeconomics, public finance, and fiscal policy. Again, thank you, Prof. Berger, for availing yourself to provide a formal response to Prof. Sachs' lecture. Now, UFS community, it is my great honor to invite our distinguished guest to the podium. Please join me in giving a warm and enthusiastic round of applause as we welcome Prof. Sachs to the podium.
Wow, thank you for that rousing, wonderful introduction. And Vice Chancellor, thank you for this wonderful invitation to be back home here. As the Vice Chancellor explained briefly, this is a homecoming for me 10 years on to becoming an alumnus of this great university when I was very fortunate to receive an honorary doctorate. And that anniversary in 2015 was the 100th anniversary of the arrival of my grandfather, who came as a 15-year-old on steerage from what is today's Ukraine, on boat, landing in Durban as far as we understand it, and then making his way to see his great uncle, who had a small shop in Vicksburg, and he left the poverty of Ukraine and came to this remarkable part of the world and lived here for 10 years, from 1915 to 1925, and brought his younger sister, who came to Bloemfontein and married and raised her family. And I'm very proud that my first cousins, once removed, are on the honor roll on the wall at Gray's College. So they did well here, I think, on the honor roll in the class of 1943. Then my grandfather in 1925 thought that he would see more of the world. He was now, I think, a 25-year-old, and he went by ship to the United States and somehow found his way to Detroit, Michigan, in the interior of the continent, and applied for a job and was invited home by the HR person who was taking the job application, and she became my great aunt because my grandfather fell in love with the younger sister. That is how my mother became my mother in 1928, and I appeared a while after that, next generation. So this is home in its way, and it's wonderful to be here. It's really personally very thrilling and very exciting to be at the University of Free State, also at this very important time for Africa. This is an important week, actually, because as you know very well, your government will be hosting the G20. It's actually maybe the G21 or G20, and I'll explain. It's especially important, G21, because the African Union was invited as a permanent member of this organization last year. And this is very important for the message that I want to give, because I believe that African unity is the key to rapid long-term development. So the AU will be represented not only through South Africa's presidency of the G20, but also through the AU being present. We were saying up until a few days ago that this really made it the G21, but my country, which is a little weird these days, is not showing up, so maybe it is the G20, and that's all for the good. So we don't know exactly what the count is, but it will be a very good and very important meeting. And I think for me, and the reason that I attend the G20 meetings each year, it's very important for the macro level that we are all interconnected, just like I explained on the most micro personal level, we're all interconnected. So if we look at humanity in any way, your individual families and how they came to be sitting here, or the world as a whole, we are an interconnected world. And the most important point for the world is that we need to understand our common humanity, and we need to learn to be peaceful, because if we do that, at least half of our economic problems are solved, because we waste so much of our time and effort and squander so many lives by all of the useless wars against people that are the same and have an intertwined history and fate. So for me, the G20 is a very important idea. I'll add as a footnote and say a little bit more later, it's a special shame, therefore, to be serious about it, that the United States doesn't show up. The United States government, this government, is absenting itself from the world responsibility and from the world community. We don't have very many good presidents in our modern history, period, but this one is the worst, just a footnote. So this is part of why we're in this story. But I believe that the interconnectedness is really the key to the puzzle of how Africa can achieve very rapid economic development in the coming decades. Because the core for that, as I'll explain briefly, is first unity within Africa. This has been a dream for decades. African unity began formally, institutionally, 62 years ago in 1963, which is why we talk about Africa 2063 as the 100th anniversary of African unity. There would have been a lot more African unity, by the way, if my government had been better behaved, because when you are powerful and imperialistic, you don't like unity among other places. So the US went out of its way to break the unity, putting the bullet in the head of some people who were leaders of African unity, like Mr. Lumumba and others. And this is why this is a hard struggle, because we don't have all that much cooperation. But the unity of Africa will be essential, as I'll explain. The second point of the interconnectedness is that Africa's relations with the rest of the world will be essential. And I believe, probably most importantly, in the next 40 years, Africa's relations with Asia, because Asia will be the dominant and fast-growing part of the world economy for the next decades. By the end of the century, there's some chance that Africa will be absolutely at the center of the world economy if you play your cards right and do a very good job because of some basic factors that I'll discuss. But progress will come through interconnectedness of Africa with the rest of the world. We learn from each other. Trade is a mutual benefit. Trade enables specialization, benefits from comparative advantage, and probably most importantly, the flow of knowledge and technology. And so Africa's engagement in trade with the rest of the world in a fair basis will be absolutely crucial for success. And since I believe China will be the most dynamic and important economy for the next 20 years at least, Africa's trade with China, I think, will be pivotal. So I'd like to explain this vision just in a brief period. And to do that, let me start with China itself, because I regard China's experience of the last 45 years as a kind of roadmap for Africa. If you can do that, you've got it made. 45 years ago, China was an impoverished country in 1980. It had been through a very tough century, like Africa. The outside world had not treated China well at all. Many of the same problematic episodes had hit China the same way that they had hit Africa. I have a theorem, which is that all problems start with the British. I hope you'll forgive me, but this is my general belief. And in the case of China, China was a stable, though not very dynamic economy at the beginning of the 19th century, but it was the giant place of the world with hundreds of millions of people, and it had been a unified state for basically for 2,000 years with very brief episodes of fragmentation. But in 1839, the British showed up in a not very helpful way and demanded that China open its trade to British opium. The British were trading India-produced opium and addicting a large part of the Chinese population. The Chinese government was trying to crack down on the opium trade, but Britain said free trade for opium and sailed into the Pearl River in 1839 and of course was militarily superior because it had already been industrializing and started what became China's century of humiliation. And China lost two wars, first to the British and then to the British and the French, the First and the Second Opium Wars. Then there was a massive, massive civil war in China, which is called the Taiping Rebellion, which cost tens of millions of lives, perhaps the greatest casualties in a civil war in world history. And then after that came more imperialism, came the Americans, came other European imperial powers, and then Japan successfully began its industrialization in the 1870s. And by 1890, though Japan was much smaller than China, it could beat up China. And so Japan invaded China in 1894, and that's when today's Taiwan and Korea fell under Japanese colonial rule for basically the next 50 years. Well, afterwards, Japan invaded China big time in the 1930s and 40s, and there were about 20 million lives lost to the Japanese invasion. I say all of this because China was impoverished and broken when it regained a kind of sovereignty in 1949, after Europe had 2 world wars and finally were so exhausted that Europe stopped, at least temporarily, beating up the rest of the world. China was able to declare the People's Republic of China in 1949, and a very difficult 30 years ensued with some ups and downs and internal political turmoil. But finally, starting in 1978, and this is where I really wanted to get to, China began an economic reform process that is probably unmatched in world history. Because starting in 1978, a new leader, Deng Xiaoping, argued that China should open up to the world economy, should engage in trade, and should plan ahead to become a developed economy. And China introduced a lot of very significant institutional and political and financial and economic reforms. It had an advantage. It was one country, so it didn't have to do it 55 times like the 55 countries of the African Union. And it was able to adopt a set of reforms starting in 1978, but especially taking off in the 1980s, that suddenly set in motion a very rapid economic growth from a very, very poor level. And this is what I want to draw your attention to. Between 1980 and 2020, that 40-year period, China achieved an average of 10% per year economic growth. When you grow 10% per year, you can apply the so-called rule of 70, which says divide 70 by the growth rate, and that tells you how many years it takes to double. So if you're growing at 10% per year, it's 70 divided by 10 is 7. 7 years for the economy to double. And if you grow 35 years at 10% per year, that's a doubling every 7 years. So that's 5 doublings. So that's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. You're 32 times larger 35 years later than when you started that process. That's the power of compound annual growth at a rapid rate. Well, China did that effectively for 40 years. And doing that means that China achieved about a 40-time increase of the gross domestic product. That's a lot. China went from 80% poverty to, on their official count, which I would vouch for, 0 extreme poverty today. They declared the end of poverty in 2020. And one reason why I think that that's true is that periodically they would ask me to take some trips inside China to look at the economy and to make some recommendations. And in 2018 or 2019, they sent me to the poorest county of China in the Ningxia Autonomous Region. And it was poor, but the first house we went into, the big problem was that the television set wasn't working quite right. And then we went to the next one, and there was electricity and television, and to the next one. I said, okay, not bad. Yes, it was a little bit muddy. There wasn't, all the amenities, but this was already a place where the poorest place was definitely above extreme poverty, and they declared zero extreme poverty by 2020. So that's what I want Africa to do. That's the assignment. That's the assignment for University of Free State. How do we do that? China is a proof of concept. It really is. There was nothing miraculous about it, and nothing predicted about it, by the way. It was not predicted that this was going to happen. In fact, had the United States predicted it, they would have gone out of their way to prevent it. Believe me. One of the things that made it work for China was that the United States didn't notice for a long time. In fact, for about 40 years, the relations were pretty benign. And it's an interesting story, because I lived through exactly this period. First, the United States viewed China as just a poor rice-growing villages, that's all. And then they viewed it in the 1970s as maybe a counterweight to the Soviet Union. So we should chummy up to China because we hate the Soviet Union, or we're competing with the Soviet Union. So remember, our president, Richard Nixon, went to China, which was a big surprise. But the idea was not that they liked China, but the idea was that this would help compete against the Soviet Union. The United States government doesn't like anybody, by the way. It's always calculating, how do we do something for somebody to do harm for somebody else? This is the whole idea of divide and conquer. So in any event, that was okay. And then China started producing our clothes and the toys and all sorts of things, and that was great. They're inexpensive. This is wonderful. So they still didn't notice. And in the 1990s, a lot of Americans were making a lot of money investing in China, and also American consumers were enjoying low-cost products coming from China. And so the U.S. took a very benign view, thank goodness, in my view, because I'm all for every place developing. I don't believe in trying to stop any place from making progress. I think it's horrendous. But in any event, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed because it was an economic failure, and it fell apart into 15 republics. Each one became a sovereign state. And then the United States said, we're number one forever, forever. No one can possibly even challenge us. And believe me, they didn't think of China as anything other than a great place to make your automotive components and your clothing and your spare parts and so forth. And so I can tell you that they just took the view that this is all fine and under control. Well, China kept its 10% per year growth for the next 20 years. And around 2010, the Americans started saying, what's going on there? They're pretty big. What's happening? And in 2015, China made a policy, which I want Africa to make, which was called Made in China 2025. So we need an Africa, Made in Africa policy 2035 or 2040. And China said, here are the key technologies, and we want to be in the lead of these technologies 10 years from now. So 10 years ago, they said, here are 10 top technologies. I was just reading a kind of panicked report by a US congressional committee that said, oh my God, they did it for 7 of the 10 industries. They really succeeded in coming to the front ranks. To my mind, I say, great, this is economic development at work. Of course, this report in Congress was, what a disaster, what do? We have to stop this, we have to choke this off, which they can't do anymore, by the way. But the point is, 40 years, China achieved this remarkable development. So what happened? I think that there are two parts of the story that I want to emphasize. One is that when you start from a low level of income, like much of Africa is today, the headroom for rapid growth is very real. If you can get organized, make the right investments, you can make big advances that are not possible if you're already at a high income level. So part of what China did is catching up economic growth. And a lot of what Africa can accomplish in the next 30 years is catching up growth, which means using the technology and the know-how that is in the world today, very powerful, very strong, very effective, and using it well for a very rapid advance of well-being. This is the first thing that China did, was effectively use catching up growth. But they've done a lot more than that because they thought ahead very effectively all through this period. And starting around 2010, as I've explained, they said, catching up growth isn't going to be enough. We need to get to the forefront of technology. And so they made industrial policies, thinking ahead, what is this world going to look like? What are the technological breakthroughs that are possible? How do we play an effective role in that? And the Made in China 2015 policy, Made in China 2025 policy that was launched in 2015 was an extremely skillful looking ahead at where technological advance was occurring and how China could insert itself into that global scientific and technological progress to create a new engine of growth, not only using what's around on the table, but becoming the leaders. And we know it's absolutely the case. We're going to be driving electric vehicles for the next 50 years, and they're going to be Chinese. Because China said already 10 years ago, they didn't produce any, but they said this is the vehicle of the future. We know that because we have to move from fossil fuels to green fuels, so we're going to go electric. And they created a productive ecosystem for innovating in electric vehicles, even reaching at one point 400 companies competing with each other. And they became the low-cost, high-quality producers of electric vehicles, which will provide a lot of their economic growth for the next 30 years. So they both engaged in catching up growth and also in innovation, and did it in an extremely skillful way. So let me turn to the African context, but with one more point, actually, just to make it clear. India is doing something like this now, with a time lag of 15 to 20 years, depending on how you argue it. India, another behemoth, it's actually even more populous than China, because China's population growth has peaked and started to come down slightly. India's population is slowing in its growth, but still is growing, and now it's overtaken China. India's about 1.5 billion people, and China's 1.4 billion people. So India is also achieving growth, not 10% per year, 7% per year. Not bad. Remember the rule of 70. You don't double in 7 years with 7% growth. It's 70 divided by 7. It takes 10 years to double. But if you're 30 years, you're 8 times larger, 2 times 2 times 2. 40 years, you are 16 times larger. So India will be a massively important economy for the world, and it will be a high-income country, but it's on a lag, as I say, from the mid-1990s, India started its takeoff. Maybe you could date it to the year 2000, more or less. Okay, I want Africa to do the same now. And I have a basic point, just a basic arithmetic point. Africa is the same size as India and China today. So Africa has 1.5 billion people. It's the same size as India. It's a little bit bigger than China, but this is a giant population, and it has the potential to follow on in this line with very rapid economic development. So that's the basic idea. How is this achieved? What is it that actually catching up growth entails? And what is it that innovation enables? So catching up growth is basically the idea and the reality that if you start in a continent where still a significant part of the population does not have reliable access to electricity, for example, where a significant part of the population does not have access to digital connectivity, where a significant part of the population doesn't have access to fast rail, and that's most of the continent. You have technologies and investments that are available that are kind of leapfrog technologies. In other words, that by making these investments not in anything unproved, but in what we know, you can make a massive increase of productivity in the economy. The second major catching up point is what the Vice Chancellor said and what UFS is devoted to and why you're in the leading edge of this process, and that is education. Because the most important productive asset in an economy are the skills of the population. And that is not a nice cliche. That's not just something nice to say. That is the literal truth of economic development. If the population is well educated, it cannot be stopped, by the way. If the population is not well educated, it cannot develop, by the way. The only way a poorly educated population can, quote, develop is if you have this vast storehouse of natural resources that somehow have a high market value so that you can have a lot of income for some time until the resources run out, but that's not development. That's a temporary boom of living standards, perhaps, but it's not development. Development is creating the productive assets for prosperity, and that requires human skills at the core of this. And this also comes back to the history. It comes back to that century of humiliation that I talked about. It comes back to India's history, because remember that India didn't only have a century of humiliation like China did. India was colonized, of course, by the British, part of my theorem, and gained independence only in 1947. One major fact of imperialism that I think is probably the most pernicious single fact of imperialism is that imperialists do not educate their colonies. Because if they try, they lose their colonies. People wake up and understand what's happening. And so the whole point is keep people disempowered. Take the resources, steal the land, do whatever you can, mine the gold, mine the diamonds, but don't provide education, except for a few people needed for some local administration or some wonderful missionary efforts. But other than that, forget it. And so almost every place that had European imperialism, by the time independence came, had a very low level of educational attainment on average. And that's because education, mass education, is a public responsibility. It doesn't just happen on its own. It's not driven by the marketplace. It has to be led by government. And if the government is hostile to this, as imperial powers are, it doesn't happen. And so I think the most important single fact of the post-imperial age is the fact of mass literacy arising. If you look in the African context, which you know well, and the effects of it, but across the whole continent, if you look at literacy in 1950, the beginnings of independence in Africa, and there's a wonderful online survey you can find of UNESCO, which wrote a paper called Literacy at Mid-Century that was published around 1952 or 1953. Illiteracy in Africa was estimated to be 95 to 100% everywhere. There was almost no literacy on the continent, aside from very small pockets of maybe some urban settlements, some few places, but by and large, this continent started without the benefits of even basic education when independence came. And you can go country by country. I don't need to tell you, it's something that I had to learn, but your neighbor, because I know that example well, Mozambique, it said, it may be wrong by a couple numbers, it said that there were 5 people with high school education at the time of independence. I don't know if that's right. Maybe it's wrong even by 50 people. But basically it was a whole country without education. And that's very hard point to start. And so this is also the reason why catching up is feasible if there's peace and enough organization for mass education. And if that happens, then human capital, so-called, that is the skill levels, of course the literacy, but especially the science, the math, the reading skills, can rise markedly. But it takes time because you need to educate young people, and they need to become more and a larger and larger part of the population. So it's a 40-year process of making the whole labor force a well-educated labor force, because older people generally don't have the ability or time or the means to go back to school, and so they will remain unskilled in the population for the time of their participation in the labor force until they retire. And so this is a long-term process, but an extremely powerful process. The rate of return to education, in my understanding, is probably the highest single rate of return of any investment that we have in society. It definitely is going to outpace the investments in AI or anything else. It's roughly 20% compound annual return to investing in a young child to carry them all the way through at least an upper secondary completion rate. So if you put these pieces together, that a poor economy starts with a weak infrastructure, and because of history with a low level of educational attainment, the possibility of very rapid growth is a reality. It's not just a dream, it is a reality. But it says then that the core of rapid economic development is an investment program, a long-term investment program in which the government takes the primary investment in educating the population and in providing the core infrastructure, the power, the transport, the digital access, the water and sanitation, the social housing, and so forth. This becomes then an investment program, and that is the key to long-term rapid economic growth, to be able to have a successful, long-term, well-designed investment program. That's what Africa needs. Now, Africa needs to also achieve what India and China receive naturally, and that is a market that is large enough at scale, by being continental scale, that the benefits of this infrastructure and education can show up in high return economic activities in the private sector. So Africa has one great challenge in addition to the normal challenge of education and infrastructure investment as the basis for long-term development, and that is unity. And it's the unity of the markets. It is making the Africa Continental Free Trade Area a reality. It is making sure that at the borders between countries, as we passed from Lesotho to South Africa this morning, that this is a routine, quick passage because this is one continental-wide economy. And with Africa, with 1.5 billion people, and with rapid growth, Africa would quickly get on the map as the third of the giant economies. That's what I want to happen. There's China, there's India, and there's Africa. And Africa should be the fastest growing of all three because it's got the greatest headroom for making this growth. Now, the last point that I want to make is you need to design this program. And this needs to be designed among the African nations. And it's a lot because by the time colonialism ended, this continent had been carved up into 55 separate countries in the African Union. But they have to think like one because no single country in Africa can succeed if the others are not succeeding. Every country needs a dynamic, continental-wide market for success, both for the inputs that they need for efficient production, for the energy systems, the power grid, the transport networks, and the markets for the production as well, because intra-African trade should soar. And so this is a major challenge to plan for success at the continental scale. And then the key of that planning is planning a public investment program that is going to be carried out at the national level, at the local level, and at the interstate level, for example, in rail or in digital or in power grids that truly are regional rather than national in scale. It could be SADC, East Africa Community, West Africa, Central Africa. It could be at a subcontinental scale, but it definitely will have to be at a regional scale. Now, the big trick of this in the end is partly the strategy, partly the design, partly adding in the innovation process, which I mentioned earlier, and I maybe if we have further discussion, I can elaborate on. But at the core of this will be the question of finance. How to raise the saving and the public sector revenues to be able to carry out a bold investment program. I'll give you one hint. Don't ask the IMF. They will give you the wrong answer. They will give you the wrong answer. What they will tell you is, be careful, education's nice, but you can't really afford it. Electricity, yeah, we heard of that. You can't afford it. So be careful, be prudent, don't overspend, don't take too much debt, and we'll see you next year. And you're growing at 2%, okay, don't complain. This is completely the wrong approach. The right approach is to say, no, we are not going to lose one child to a lack of education because we don't have the finance. We're not going to live without electricity or digital access or AI or other connectivity because then we're going to be left behind for another century. So we need a growth-oriented financial strategy. There are 2 points I would make to this. One is that what looks like a lot of debt, if you say, well, we'll borrow to do this, if you take into account the lessons of rapid growth, that you might be 10, 20, or even 40 times larger economy in 30 years from now. What it means is that the capacity to borrow for rapid growth is much higher than it looks. And all of this absolute conservatism in Washington at the International Monetary Fund is not well thought out. They say the debt's too high. But the answer is yes, but we're not going to be poor forever. We're going to use this debt for rapid economic growth, and then when the debt comes due, we're going to be much richer, so it's not going to look very large. This is the basic analytical work that needs to be done, to break out of the short-term idea and look to the long-term and see, therefore, we have a lot more capacity of finance. But the second point is the quality of the financing. You can't borrow short-term for long-term development. You can't borrow for 5 years for education because you'll put the first grader up through 6th grade, but you won't have the means to repay the financing for education. So structuring long-term finance based on high growth is the bottom line. It's not simple, but it can be done. And this is where I think the analytical work of our economics departments and the universities, combining both the practical planning of a policy framework with the knowledge of what Made in Africa 2035 and Made in Africa 2040 is going to look like, is going to show that this idea of a very high ambition, high growth scenario is absolutely feasible. The last point that I want to mention is that the fast-growing partners for Africa in the world are not the traditional counterparts, not imperial or post-imperial, I don't know what they are, Europe, or the United States, because both by being high income already and with politics that is not working in the United States or Europe, our countries are limping along. They are not the rapid growth partners for Africa. China, India, Southeast Asia, West Asia, these countries are growing 5, 6, 7, 8% per year. They are high-saving regions. They're lending money at much lower interest rates and longer term than you can get in London or New York or in the traditional financial markets. So this is where I think the real international partnerships will lie. Had the United States shown up for the G20 this week, it would have spent much of the time saying, don't trade with China. Fortunately, they're not even here. So I will say trade with China and enjoy your rapid economic growth. Thank you very much.
Jeff, thank you for a thoughtful presentation, lecture. What I've learned over the years is that you can always listen, and the man didn't even have notes with him. You know, he spoke, unlike me. So the conversations we've had over the years very much are in tune of this. South Africa's economic growth, you talk about, you know, when we apply that rule of 70, at the moment if we are lucky, we get to about 1%. That would take us 70 years to double. So in our case, we really need to come up with a plan. And then I think the core components that you talked about are very, very important and are indeed the core elements that we need for such a policy. So indeed, South Africa's per capita growth has been negative since 2012. And in that year, we introduced a national development plan, and it projected growth of 5.4%. I'm not sure how they got to 5.4, why not 5.5 or 5? But nevertheless, it was 5.4%. That was the objective for 2030. It turned out to be different. The per capita growth is negative, and we have a stalled economy. Now, at least we have seen some good news in the last week or two. We've gotten off the grey list. Our Minister of Finance basically sort of announced that we are finally able to arrest the increase in the debt-GDP ratio. The inflation targeting, the 3%, I think, is the right thing to do. So, and the exchange rate all of a sudden is much stronger. They tell me it's dollar weakness. So to hear that, to talk about rand strength versus dollar weakness, that is indeed a change in tune for us. But nevertheless, we still have a major challenge because at 0.7, 0.9%, 1%, our economic growth is still, yes, less than the population growth rate of about 1.3%. So in that sense, we need growth. And we can ask, why do we need growth? Because if you follow the international debates, there's a whole school of thought that talk about degrowth. That said, well, because of all the environmental damage we have done and because of the capacity of the planet to carry, that capacity is limited, or, that we've reached the limit to our growth, to paraphrase the Club of Rome report in 1972. Because of that, we need to degrowth. We need to bring back our growth. But what do we do then in emerging market economies? Because the material dimension of poverty is a lack of essential goods and services. There are also other dimensions to it, but the material dimensions. So we talk about nutritional food, clean water, basic and decent housing, basic household assets such as fridges to keep things cool in hot temperatures, stoves, but also social goods, education, healthcare. All of those things, and in the digital era, and Jeff also talked about that, increasingly, I would think that digital connectivity is an essential element to what we need to lift people out of poverty, because it allows people to participate in the economy. But all those goods together is, of course, what we economists like to call gross domestic product. So if we want more of these goods, we need to increase that, and that is what we call economic growth. So in that sense, we need the economic growth. And the question therefore becomes, how do we balance this very valid concern we have of a whole humanity collectively living beyond the capacity of this planet, while there are still millions, indeed billions, who are in poverty, and who we still need to live we need to lift out of poverty. And I think here, in this sense, what we really need to look at is green technology. And I know when you open the Wall Street Journal and so on, it's not in vogue so much in the, if I see there was also, if you look at ESG, the number of companies reporting on that has increased, and then it dipped again with the new regime coming in. But it will have to come back. These limits still exist. And if we really want to reconcile the need for getting people to lift them out of poverty with living within the limits of this world, we will need to look at green technology. Jeff mentioned the whole thing about electricity. You know, we have too little electricity in this continent, and instead of building huge coal stations, erecting solar energy it doesn't take that long to erect it. And it is getting cheaper than coal. I always mention that, you know, we have the western part of South Africa, where there's not a lot of people living there. The irradiation factor there is higher than in the Sahara Desert. That part of the country is the size of Germany. If we put that under solar, we have enough power for the whole Southern Africa, not just for South Africa. So in that sense, we need to look at that. And there's all sorts of other things we need to can do in a green sense. And as a continent, to link all of this together, because our water supplies are very limited, our electricity supplies are very limited, but also interlinked. We get water from Lesotho. The water we get here, a large component of that comes from the Lesotho highlands. So we need to think about all of that. I think the other thing, and I'm very happy you talked about, you know, thinking about the unity in Africa. If we just look at SADC, there's more than 300 million people living in SADC. If we can lift just 10% of those people into the middle class in the next 10 years, think about what market that entails, what market opportunity that entails to grow these economies. All these people will need cities, they will need houses, they will need fridges, they will need all sorts of things. And it's not overseas trade, it's cross-border overland trade. And there's a huge, for that we indeed need to reduce transport costs. You know, at the moment it costs more than to transport sugar from Zambia to South Africa than it is to import it from Brazil. Because these trains go back empty the other way. And we need upgraded rail. So all of that are things that we really need. And in South Africa too, the economic growth, why we need it. So we've heard a lot of people who say that we have jobless growth. We have growth and it only goes to those who are rich. When we look at the numbers, it's not quite true. Since 2010 up till now, this economy has grown at a very low 1.2% per year. Employment has grown by 1.3%. If we only look from 2015, it is 0.7% growth in the economy, 0.7% growth in employment. The problem is not that the growth is jobless. The problem is that we don't have growth. And therefore, we need growth. If we have growth, we can lift, it's almost a one-to-one relationship there that we can establish. And in that sense, and that is actually quite a good employment or ratio of reaction of employment to an increase in GDP. And South Africa really does that, needs that. Our population, our labor of the population between 16 and 64 is growing by about 1.3% per annum at the moment. And that has meant that in the last 10 years, employment in total has grown by 9%, but the number of unemployed people have grown by 60%. Which means that we as a country look into some very stark numbers. So at the moment there's 8 million, what came out last week, 8 million unemployed people officially, and if you include those who are discouraged work seekers because they've given up, they couldn't find jobs, if we add them, we end up at 12.5 million. The formal sector in this economy employs 12 million people. So there are more people unemployed than there are people in formal employment. Luckily, the informal sector has served as a bit of a buffer. So that has grown. There's about 4 million people now. So 1 in 4 people work in the informal sector. But our legislation is very, if you look at urban legislation in terms of urban, where you can settle, open up businesses, and all the regulation, the bylaws, it's very restrictive. If you see, these raids that the police sometimes do in small informal traders in Joburg. So those are the things we need to rethink if we want to boost this. But that is in terms of the link between economic growth and job growth. The other one is, of course, also our constitutional imperative. So when I saw in the US the shutdown that took place about a difference about whether or not to fund people's health care, our Constitution simply does not allow that sort of debate to take place, because healthcare is a right enshrined in the population, which is to be realized progressively, but if the state can afford it, it needs to pay for it. We cannot have a debate about whether an Obamacare is valid or not. But we still need to pay for these, to realize these rights. And our Constitution talks about the progressive realization of socio-economic rights, which means, and if you then look at the Grootboom case and some of the other cases and Subramani cases, it really turns about on the ability of the state. Does it have the resources? And if we look at economic growth, that is where we need to generate the taxes to help us fund those things. So the moment we therefore start to talk about progressive realization, we introduce a time element in the whole realization of socioeconomic rights. And these socioeconomic rights speak very much to something else Jeff was very involved with, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, and these things speak to each other. But when we talk about all of that, what comes to mind then often that I think about is in 1987 you had what was called the Brundtland Report with the World Commission on Environment and Development. And they defined sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that report served as a basis later on for the Kyoto stuff, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think there is something in there that when we talk about growing the economy, so it's not just about creation of jobs, but it is also how do we realize these rights for people, their healthcare, housing, education, all of those rights, and because all of those things speak to what we would consider as elements of sustainable development. If you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I suppose, Jeff, we will have to start talking about the SDGs 2.0, because in a few years' time it runs out. But how to get to that, and there I agree with Jeff. If we look at the two main things we really need: investment in infrastructure, investment in production capacity. My own research shows that, for instance, private investment, if private investment as percentage of GDP is at a very low 11-12%. If we can, every percentage point with which we can raise that adds about 0.6% to economic growth. If we can raise that from 12 to 15%, we can lift our economic growth rate from the 1% to the 3% the government is now talking in its a new gain policy that they've talked about last week. So in that sense, investment is very important. The link to that, though, is unfortunately the evidence shows that the public sector investment is not very productive. And I don't even have to elaborate a lot about that. I mean, you all know the billions we spent on the Medupi and Kusile power stations. They were 15 years in the production, and only now they're starting to get online and supplying the power we need. But we really need to look at the productivity and efficiency of our public investment to make them more efficient. And in that, I think we need to get over this debate about whether it's the state or the public, the state or the market. It's both. We need all hands on deck to make this actually work. So in that sense, investment is very important, and I think also in the region, we need infrastructure, railroads. Jeff talked about railroads. We need railroads. We need to upgrade our harbors. You know about the corridor that they're building between in the south of the Congo to Lubito in Angola. We look at the export through Maputo Harbor, Walfish Bay, all these harbors. We need to ensure that these things are managed properly, because as we know, when the efficiency of these harbors internationally are ranked, we come out dead last. But those are the things we need to fix. And if we can do that, I think we will come far to lift the bottlenecks. So energy, water is the other thing that we really need to address, and that is a regional project, because it's not the water. The other thing of colonial borders is people before colonial, the colonial era, they lived on both sides of the rivers, and then the colonists came and they used the river as the dividing line, which means the same families lived on both sides, but now in two different countries. Graça Machel once said, we have Setoles living in Zimbabwe, we have Setoles in Mozambique, and we have Setoles in South Africa, and the same with the Moyos. So in that sense, these water resources, these rivers, many of these rivers form our boundaries, but we need to manage them properly and invest in them to maintain them, because we also pollute them terribly. So all of that needs integrated planning going forward. And then lastly, the whole education thing. Education is the one renewable resource there is. Unlike coal, as long as there are people who we can educate, it's a renewable resource. We just need to get going with that. And we know when we look at South Africa's performance in the TIMS and the PIRLS tests, we are really not doing well. So there's an efficiency of education issue that we need to talk about. How do we increase that? And then there's a quality of education. In Jeff's lecture that he presented here in 2015, he cited Hanushek and Wussman, two authors who said it's not so much the quantity of education, but the quality of education that impacts growth. So it's not just whether you put kids through 12 years of schooling, it's about the quality of that schooling. And we really need to look at that, to improve the quality, because the better the quality education you deliver, the higher your growth rate is. That is incidentally also something that China has learned. And China, and Korea and Vietnam, Japan, all those countries in the Far East who really put a lot of attention pay a lot of attention to education. And even India now, indeed, when you see some of the world's best engineers come from India. So that education, the quality education, is very important. And in that sense, the big question that we all face in South Africa, but also in Africa, is how to mobilize more resources. So South Africa spends about 6% of GDP on education, which compared to other countries is quite a lot. But of course, 1% of education in rand terms in South Africa is quite something different from 1% of education in Europe or in the US. And on the other side, 1% of South Africa, 1% of GDP in South Africa is way more money than 1% in next door Lesotho. So we really need to look at the amounts of money that we need to invest to get kids through school. And then we need to ask, we were briefly talking about, Jeff was very involved with the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And, there has been an effort like that for education, but really we need to think about how to mobilize resources for education. Because yes, the return is not going to be next year or in 10 years, but it is going to be there in 30 years. And long-term bonds issued for 30 years, maybe with an interest rate equals to a growth rate. So it starts paying bigger interest once the growth picks up. And when will the growth pick up? Well, when these bonds start, or when the kids trained with these bonds, when they become adults and start generating that growth. That is maybe one way of thinking about this. But indeed, if you think about the projections of population growth, so Africa is 1.5 billion people. Some projections put it at 3.5, 4 billion by the end of the century. That's between 2 and 2.5 billion kids that need to be educated in the next 75 years. We better start thinking about how to do that. And I think that is a call for all of us, particularly here in South Africa. And I know that we are, also at this university starting to think about that, how to design policy. And because it's policy on various levels. We know what needs to be done, but it is what do we teach? How do we do this institutionally, structurally? How do we deal with the incentives that current structures and so on create? That's the sort of stuff that we need to talk about. And then I suppose we need to get cracking. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. Colleagues, you would agree with me that Prof. Sachs' presentation is so much thought-provoking. I will just touch on a few items that I tried to absorb as I was sitting there like a sponge. First, African unity. And this is very critical, and it's key. Second, learn to be peaceful. As it is right now, we waste a lot of resources, finance, and this is across the world. Interconnectedness, how much are we tapping into that? But most importantly, China's experience. This is a typical good case study. So what I did is I had to put China on the table and Africa on the table as for comparison. And guess what? He illustrated clearly that within 40 to 45 years, China had already grown massively. What is China showing us? Development is possible. Now we are putting Africa on the table. We have been struggling for years. What is Africa showing us? Development is difficult. But the most important aspect that he mentioned then, which is very critical, so still on China, he touched on catching up. And it should be simple for real, because already we can simply and easily adopt something that is there, to adopt it to villages that are not, connected. It's as simple as that, okay? But other than catching up, so the catching up, he touched it in terms of, the accessibility. He talked about the catching up in terms of the education. But he also spoke about getting to the front. And because that's what China did. Years after catching up, then what? Guess what? Prof, you put it so well when you actually said, but all this requires the designing of a good program. So as Africa, we are being challenged. You gave us a homework, by the way. Thank you, Prof. And equally so, I found Prof. Berger's response to be active, thoughtful, and inquisitive. He highlights critical issues. In actual fact, he decided to zero into South Africa, indicating the negative economic growth that we have been experiencing as a country, the stalled economy, but we are seeing the rand strengthening. But again, he brought the most important aspect of sustainability. Of course, for years, we have been talking about economic growth. That's simply growing the cake. But after the cake is grown, we also have been thinking about sharing of that cake. Who is getting what? But he then brought the aspect of worrying about the oven that bakes the cake, the planet. And that's why we speak of the planetary adjusted HDI. Okay, so I found this quite interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to waste a lot of your time now, okay? Thank you, Prof. Sachs. Thank you, Prof. Berger. Now, can I request Prof. Klopper and Prof. Sachs to come to the stage? Prof. Klopper, may you hand over our small token of appreciation to Prof. Sachs. Thank you. UFS community, let's again express our big appreciation to Prof. Sachs' presentation. Can we just have a big... As you can see, before even realizing, okay, we have come to the end of today's event. Let me give special thanks, of course, to our special guest, Prof. Sachs, and your wife, Ms. Sonia. We sincerely appreciate your support in allowing Prof. Sachs to be with us today. Prof. Berger, thank you for the response, and thank you to the executive, staff, and students of the UFS, all guests who have been watching live stream, thank you. Our service providers, we thank you. The Department of Communication and Marketing, again, we thank you. To all those not mentioned by their names, please accept my sincere gratitude. We can proceed and have refreshments by the foyer. Thank you.